In the fading light of a late Cold War afternoon, the world's most powerful weapons sat poised in underground silos, aboard submarines gliding through dark oceans, and on bombers waiting on dimly lit runways. In the United States and the Soviet Union, command centers hummed with quiet urgency, radar screens glowing, telephones never far from a hand, officers trained to make decisions in minutes that could end civilization in hours. For decades, nuclear strategy had rested on a brutal logic, mutually assured destruction. Each side held enough firepower to obliterate the other, and the certainty of retaliation was supposed to keep the peace. But in the early 1980s, that balance was strained to the breaking point. In this tense atmosphere, NATO planned a routine war game, a command post exercise called Able Archer 83. It was meant to test procedures, to rehearse what leaders might do if a crisis in Europe spiraled from conventional fighting into nuclear war. On paper, it was just another simulation. In practice, it would come alarmingly close to being mistaken for the real thing. As NATO officers moved markers on maps and sent coded messages through secure lines, Soviet intelligence watched with growing alarm. Already primed to see danger in every Western move, some in Moscow became convinced that behind the exercise lay a deadly secret, that the West might be using the cover of a drill to prepare an actual first strike. For several days in November 1983, as Able Archer played out, Soviet nuclear forces in Eastern Europe quietly moved to a higher state of readiness. The world, without knowing it, edged closer to disaster. How did a planned training exercise, never intended to leave the realm of fiction, almost nudge humanity into World War III? To understand that near miss, we have to return to 1983, a year many historians now regard as one of the most dangerous of the entire Cold War. By then, the United States and the Soviet Union had reached a grim kind of nuclear parity. Each side had thousands of warheads, mounted on intercontinental missiles, submarine-launched missiles, and long-range bombers. The concept of mutually assured destruction had become doctrine. Any nuclear attack would trigger an automatic, devastating response. But while this balance of terror was supposed to deter war, it also meant that miscalculation, misunderstanding, or a false alarm could be catastrophic. New technologies were compressing decision times. Faster, more accurate missiles reduced the interval between launch and impact. In Europe, the United States was deploying new Pershing II ballistic missiles and ground-launched cruise missiles, weapons designed to fly low and fast, reaching Soviet targets in a fraction of the time older systems required. To Western planners, these deployments were a counter to Soviet missiles already aimed at NATO allies. To Soviet leaders, they looked like a potential decapitation tool, something that might strike their command centers before they could order a response. The political climate made everything worse. In Washington, President Ronald Reagan, a former actor turned conservative leader, had come into office determined to rebuild American strength. He increased defense spending, accelerated new weapons programs, and did not shy away from stark moral language. In speeches, he cast the Soviet Union as a fundamentally hostile system, an adversary that had to be confronted rather than accommodated. In Moscow, this rhetoric did not sound like posturing. It sounded like preparation for conflict. On the Soviet side, the leadership was aging and brittle. At the top sat Yuri Andropov, a former KGB chief who had risen to become General Secretary of the Communist Party. He was intelligent and deeply familiar with Western politics, but he was also physically unwell and politically constrained. Suspicious of American intentions, and surrounded by officials shaped by decades of Cold War confrontation, Andropov viewed Reagan's build-up through the lens of worst-case thinking. Recent events had only deepened that suspicion. Just months before Able Archer, a passenger jet, Korean Airlines Flight 007, had strayed off course and entered Soviet airspace. Mistaken for a potential spy plane, it was shot down by a Soviet interceptor, killing everyone on board. The incident shocked the world and drove US-Soviet relations to a new low. In Moscow, the leadership braced for retaliation. In Washington, anger hardened. Meanwhile, NATO continued its regular cycle of military exercises, intelligence flights, and naval maneuvers. To Western planners, these were routine demonstrations of readiness. To Soviet analysts, already haunted by the memory of 1941, when Nazi Germany had launched a surprise invasion that nearly destroyed their country, they looked like possible preludes to something worse. The trauma of that earlier surprise attack, when warning signs had been missed or ignored, lingered in Soviet strategic culture. Never again, they vowed, would they be caught unprepared. Out of this mindset emerged Operation Ryan, a secret KGB program whose name roughly translated to nuclear missile attack. Launched under Andropov's watch, Operation Ryan tasked Soviet intelligence officers around the world with a singular mission: detect any sign, however small, that the West might be preparing a first strike. Embassies were given detailed lists of indicators to watch for changes in government travel patterns, unusual activity at military bases, sudden lights burning late in Western command centers, even fluctuations in blood supplies at hospitals. The logic was simple and chilling. If they could piece together enough of these clues, the Soviet leadership might gain a few precious hours of warning before missiles flew. But Operation Ryan did more than collect information. It shaped how that information was interpreted. KGB officers, under pressure to find evidence of Western plots, began to treat ordinary events as potential harbingers of catastrophe. A routine exercise might be seen as a cover. A new communication system could be interpreted as a sign of imminent war. The institutional fear that the Soviet Union might be caught off guard again encouraged confirmation bias. Analysts were more likely to notice and emphasize data that fit their expectations of a looming threat. Instead of calming nerves, Operation Ryan heightened them, creating an atmosphere in which even a training drill like Able Archer could be read as a deadly ruse. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, NATO planners were focused on a different problem. Each autumn, the alliance conducted a series of command post exercises to test its ability to manage a crisis in Europe. These were largely paper drills, involving maps, teletypes, and simulated messages rather than troops in the field. By 1983, however, there was a growing sense among NATO officers that their exercises needed to be more realistic, especially when it came to the most sensitive part of all, the procedures for deciding whether to use nuclear weapons. Able Archer 83 was designed to be that more realistic test. It would walk participants through a hypothetical conflict that began with political tension, escalated into conventional fighting, and then, under mounting pressure, forced leaders to consider the unthinkable, authorizing nuclear strikes. The scenario unfolded step by step. In the script, a crisis in Europe deepened. Conventional forces clashed, and NATO began to lose ground. As the fictional war worsened, the exercise moved into its most sensitive phase: simulated consultations among allied governments about whether to request, approve, and ultimately release nuclear weapons. The goal was to practice the complex chain of communication and decision-making that would be needed in a real emergency. Messages would be drafted, coded, and transmitted. Military commanders would request authorization. Political leaders, at least on paper, would weigh options. It was all supposed to be contained within the safe boundaries of simulation. What made Able Archer different from previous exercises, however, were the very features that made it seem more realistic to NATO and more threatening to the Soviets. New, more secure communication systems were used, including channels and encryption methods that looked from the outside like the tools one might employ in an actual crisis. The script called for the involvement, at least in notional form, of top-level political figures, heads of government and defense ministers, whose participation signaled that the scenario had reached the highest stakes. And crucially, the simulated nuclear release messages were crafted to resemble real orders, following the correct formats and procedures. To those inside the exercise, this was good training. To those watching from afar, with incomplete information and deep suspicion, it could look like the real thing. As Able Archer got underway, Soviet intelligence stations in Europe and beyond took notice. They tracked the movement of NATO commanders, the uptick in communications traffic, the apparent shift from conventional to nuclear-related procedures. Within the framework of Operation Ryan, these were precisely the kinds of indicators that analysts had been told to watch for. Reports began to flow back to Moscow: unusual activity at Western command posts, changes in alert levels at certain bases, the use of new encrypted channels. For analysts primed to expect a surprise attack, the pattern looked ominous. Could this be the moment they had been warned about? A Western first strike disguised as an exercise, allowing NATO forces to mobilize under the cover of routine training? Inside the Soviet system, alarms started to ring, if not publicly, then within the classified world of military and intelligence assessments. Operation Ryan officers flagged Able Archer as a potential cover operation. The fact that NATO seemed to be rehearsing nuclear release procedures, using realistic formats and involving senior figures, fit their darkest expectations. In response, the Soviet military began to adjust its posture, quietly but significantly. Nuclear-capable aircraft in East Germany and Poland were placed on higher alert. Crews were brought closer to their planes, weapons were readied, and some units reportedly prepared for the possibility that they might have to launch on short notice. Warsaw Pact command structures also increased their readiness, ensuring that orders from Moscow could be transmitted and carried out quickly if the worst came to pass. At the top of the Soviet hierarchy, decisions were made by a small circle around Yuri Andropov. But Andropov himself was in poor health, spending much of his time in hospitals or secluded residences. His direct exposure to Western media and unofficial channels of information was limited. What he saw and heard about Able Archer came largely through the filter of his own intelligence and military services, institutions already inclined to interpret Western moves in the most threatening light. Within this inner circle, there were debates and doubts. Some officials believed that NATO would not risk such a brazen deception. Others, remembering the surprise of 1941 and the hostile tone of recent American rhetoric, argued that they could not afford to dismiss the danger. The central question was stark. Was Able Archer just an exercise, or was it the final rehearsal before a real attack? For a brief, tense window, the answer was not clear. Soviet forces were not yet launching missiles, but they were closer to that threshold than usual. The very uncertainty of the situation became a factor in itself. If NATO was indeed preparing a first strike, waiting too long could be fatal for the Soviet state. If, on the other hand, the Soviets overreacted and moved first based on a misreading, they might start the war they feared. In this narrow space between doubt and panic, human judgment, shaped by fear, experience, and incomplete information, held the line. The world was spared, not by any formal agreement or shared understanding, but by the reluctance of leaders to take the irrevocable step from suspicion to action. As the scripted days of Able Archer passed, NATO participants carried out their roles, largely oblivious to the alarm they were causing on the other side. In Western command centers, officers followed the scenario, sent their simulated messages, and then, as the exercise drew to a close, began the routine process of standing down. The fictional war ended on paper. The simulated nuclear release procedures were completed and filed away as training experience. To those involved, it had been a complex but successful drill. There were lessons to be learned about communication, coordination, and technical procedures. Few, if any, suspected that their exercise had been interpreted by some in Moscow as the possible prelude to Armageddon. On the Soviet side, as Able Archer wound down without any sign of an actual Western attack, the immediate sense of crisis slowly ebbed. The feared missile launches never came. NATO forces began returning to normal patterns. The indicators that Operation Ryan officers had been tracking no longer pointed toward imminent war. Gradually, nuclear-capable units in East Germany and Poland eased back from their heightened alert status. The Soviet military, while still wary, stepped away from the brink. Internally, there were assessments and after-action reviews. Some in the Soviet system took the episode as proof that their vigilance had been justified, that only by preparing for the worst had they ensured their survival. Others may have quietly wondered whether they had come perilously close to misreading a drill as a death sentence. In the West, almost no one noticed. There was no dramatic showdown, no public crisis, no televised addresses about a brush with nuclear war. Able Archer came and went, filed under routine training. The Soviet reaction was hidden behind the walls of secrecy that surrounded Warsaw Pact military planning. Intelligence agencies in the United States and its allies picked up fragments of information about unusual Soviet alerts, but the full picture remained murky. Without a visible flashpoint, a Cuban-style standoff, a public ultimatum, the episode slipped into the classified archives of both sides, overshadowed by more visible confrontations and more dramatic headlines. It would take years before the true significance of Able Archer 83 began to emerge. In the late 1980s and 1990s, as the Cold War thawed and then ended, Western governments began declassifying documents from the period. Intelligence assessments, diplomatic cables, and internal memoranda were released to scholars and journalists. Among them were reports indicating that during Able Archer, the Soviet Union had taken real, concrete steps to raise the alert status of some of its nuclear forces. Additional evidence came later as historians gained limited access to Soviet and Warsaw Pact records. These documents, though incomplete and sometimes fragmentary, painted a sobering picture. The Soviet leadership had not treated Able Archer as just another NATO exercise. They had seen it as a potential cover for attack, and had responded with measures that, in a different atmosphere, could have escalated further. The declassified materials also revealed that within NATO and the United States, some analysts had been aware, even at the time, that Soviet fears of a Western first strike were growing. Intelligence reports warned that Moscow's perception of American intentions was darkening, that Operation Ryan was driving a search for signs of imminent attack. But the depth of Soviet anxiety and the specific reaction to Able Archer were not fully appreciated until much later. When historians and former officials began to piece together the story, debates quickly followed. How close had the world actually come to nuclear war in November 1983? Some argued that the Soviet alerts were precautionary, a defensive hedge rather than a prelude to action. Others pointed to the combination of misperception, heightened readiness, and compressed decision times as evidence that the danger had been far from theoretical. Testimony from those who had served on both sides added human texture to the archival record. Former Western officials described their surprise at learning, years later, how seriously the Soviets had taken the exercise. Retired Soviet officers and intelligence veterans recalled the atmosphere of suspicion, the pressure to detect a Western first strike, and the genuine fear that a sudden attack might come under the guise of routine maneuvers. While memories differed and interpretations varied, a broad consensus emerged. Able Archer 83 had been a real, if largely invisible, brush with disaster, a moment when the structural dangers of the nuclear age were laid bare. For Ronald Reagan, the American president whose policies and rhetoric had helped create the tense climate of the early 1980s, the revelation of Soviet fears had a profound impact. As information filtered up to him about how Moscow had interpreted Western actions, about Operation Ryan, about the alerts during Able Archer, Reagan began to reflect more deeply on the risks of miscalculation. He had long believed that the Soviet system was repressive and dangerous, but he now better understood that Soviet leaders, however flawed, were also afraid. They did not see themselves as aggressors preparing for conquest. They saw themselves as a besieged power, vulnerable to a technologically superior rival. This realization reinforced Reagan's growing conviction that a nuclear war could never be allowed to happen, that in such a conflict there could be no meaningful victory, only shared devastation. In the years after Able Archer, subtle but important shifts appeared in U.S. policy and tone. While the military buildup continued and new initiatives like the Strategic Defense Initiative, Reagan's proposed missile defense program kept tensions alive, there was also a greater emphasis on communication and arms control. The Strategic Defense Initiative itself played a dual role. It alarmed Soviet planners, who feared it might undermine their deterrent, but it also became a bargaining chip in negotiations. Behind the scenes, American officials worked to improve channels for crisis communication, to ensure that future exercises and maneuvers would be less likely to be misread as preparations for attack. The memory of 1983 and the knowledge that a routine drill had merely been mistaken for a first strike hung in the background of these efforts. On the Soviet side, change came with the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev, a younger, more reform-minded leader who became general secretary after a succession of elderly predecessors. Gorbachev inherited an economy strained by the arms race and a society weary of stagnation. He recognized that the endless competition in nuclear and conventional forces was not only economically unsustainable, but also existentially reckless. The risk that a misunderstanding, a technical glitch, or a misinterpreted exercise could trigger catastrophe weighed heavily on his thinking. Gorbachev was more open than his predecessors to dialogue with the West, to transparency measures, and to rethinking long-held doctrines. Together, Reagan and Gorbachev, each shaped in part by the near-miss dangers of the early 1980s, began to chart a different course. They made greater use of the direct hotline between Washington and Moscow, not just as an emergency tool, but as a symbol of their willingness to talk. Military-to-military contacts were expanded, providing more opportunities to clarify intentions and reduce the risk of surprise. Most tangibly, the two leaders negotiated and signed the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles from Europe, including the very types that had so alarmed the Soviets during the Able Archer period. Over time, further agreements and unilateral steps helped ease the hair-trigger posture of the late Cold War, lengthening decision times and reducing the number of weapons on the highest levels of alert. The story of Able Archer 83, once buried in classified files, thus became part of a larger narrative about how close the nuclear age had come to disaster, and how that knowledge pushed leaders toward restraint. It offered a stark lesson about the dangers of realistic exercises conducted in a climate of fear. What NATO saw as necessary training, the Soviet Union saw as possible cover for aggression. The secrecy that surrounded both sides' preparations, intended to protect national security, instead increased the risk of misinterpretation. Without transparency, without prior notification or shared understandings, a war game could be indistinguishable from the opening moves of a real war. Able Archer also highlighted the limits of intelligence and the power of perception. Operation Ryan, conceived as a way to prevent surprise, became a case study in threat inflation. By instructing its officers to search relentlessly for signs of a Western first strike, the Soviet system created a feedback loop in which ambiguous data was constantly pulled toward the most dangerous interpretation. Western rhetoric and military posture fed Soviet fears. Soviet reactions, in turn, reinforced Western assumptions about Soviet aggressiveness. In this closed circuit of suspicion, the space for calm, objective analysis shrank. The relevance of these lessons did not end with the Cold War. In a world where multiple states possess nuclear weapons, where rival blocs conduct regular military drills near each other's borders, and where new technologies compress decision times even further, the risk of miscalculation remains. Modern exercises, cyber operations, and missile tests can all be misread by an anxious adversary. The story of Able Archer underscores the enduring need for robust hotlines, clear protocols, advanced notifications, and confidence-building measures that reduce ambiguity. It reminds us that in the nuclear age, misunderstanding can be as dangerous as malice. Looking back, Able Archer 83 stands as a paradox, a crisis that changed the course of history without being widely recognized as a crisis at the time. While politicians argued in public about missiles and ideology, while citizens marched in anti-nuclear protests or went about their lives unaware, a quiet near-war played out in the shadows of command centers and intelligence offices. No missiles were launched, no ultimatums were broadcast, yet the episode left a subtle but real imprint on the minds of those who later learned how close things had come. In its aftermath, leaders on both sides were nudged by fear, by hindsight, and by a dawning sense of shared vulnerability toward de-escalation. They did not abandon their rivalries or their disagreements, but they began to treat nuclear weapons with a deeper respect for their uncontrollable consequences. The world was lucky in 1983. Luck, however, is not a strategy. What ultimately stood between Able Archer and Armageddon were human beings, making choices under pressure, guided by intuition, caution, and, perhaps, an instinctive reluctance to cross a line from which there could be no return. As we move from images of Cold War launch keys and concrete silos to today's digital command systems and diplomatic video calls, the core dilemma remains: how to live with weapons that can end civilization and how to ensure that fear and misunderstanding do not ignite them. The near miss of Able Archer 83 is a reminder that the most dangerous moments are not always the ones that make headlines. Sometimes, the world is saved not by grand speeches or dramatic showdowns, but by crises that pass almost unseen. Except, years later, in the quiet pages of declassified files and in the lessons we choose to draw from them,